It's been described as the most grueling of all Olympic disciplines. 26 miles, more than 2 hours of pain. The marathon has produced some of the game's most tragic and triumphant stories, and remains the longest of all the roads to Olympic glory. It is thought that the longest of all the running events on the Olympic program derives from the legend of Phidippides. In the year 490 BC, he ran the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens to tell of a famous Greek victory over the invading Persians. On announcing this important news, he collapsed from exhaustion and died. So, when the modern games were first convened in Athens, the marathon was part of the program. The race itself attracted a field of 17 athletes for the start on Marathon Bridge on April the 10th, 1896. All but 4 of them were Greek. The course followed the hilly route between Marathon and Athens, some 26 miles. Two hours and 58 minutes later, the stadium in Athens erupted at the sight of a Greek runner entering first. Reports of the day indicate how the princes, Constantine and George, were so thrilled to see him first that they ran alongside him to the finish line. His name, Spiridon Lewis. He was just 18. In appreciation of his success, the Greek government gave Lewis a farm, to which he later retired. Some 40 years later, the German Olympic Committee invited Lewis to the Berlin Games as guest of honor. He died 4 years later, in 1940. The marathon was well and truly established as an Olympic discipline by the time the Games arrived in London in 1908. Only the distance was still in dispute. The British royal family soon ended that. The race that year began some 26 miles or 42 kilometers outside London in the grounds of Windsor Castle. The athletes were to run a total of 26 miles and 385 yards, the extra yardage being added so that the runners would finish in London's White City Stadium in front of the Royal Box. They witnessed a dramatic finish with the now famous Dorando Pietri incident. The Italians staggered into the stadium in first place, but collapsed so many times that officials, concerned for his well-being, rushed to his rescue and helped him to the line. The help, thought to be necessary at the time, was to cost the luckless Italian the title. Second-placed American John Hayes complained to officials, and his appeal was upheld. Hayes was made Olympic champion. Dorando Pietri was awarded a special gold cup by Queen Alexandra, and subsequently became an international celebrity. Heat and humidity have often played a large part in the outcome of the Olympic marathon. In 1900 in Paris, the temperatures reached 39 degrees and only 7 runners managed to finish. In 1912 in Stockholm, it was again oppressively hot and less than half the field finished. The race claimed a casualty as 21-year-old Francisco Lazaro from Portugal collapsed from sunstroke towards the end of the race and was taken to hospital, where he died the following day. He is one of only 2 athletes ever to die as a result of their competing in the Olympic Games. The Swedish organizers could hardly be criticized for this unfortunate incident, as they had been the first in the marathon's history to provide refreshment and watering points. It was at one such drink stand that the outcome of the race was decided. The two leading runners were both South Africans. As they neared the stadium, running together, Christian Gitchem stopped for a drink. His companion, Kenneth MacArthur, promised to wait for him, but then decided not to. And the unfortunate Gitchem was left stranded in second place. MacArthur duly became Olympic champion. Gitchem didn't seem very happy about it, though. Throughout the marathon's checkered history, it has attracted its fair share of cheats and liars. In 1904, for instance, a New Yorker, Fred Lortz, committed the marathon runner's biggest sin by accepting a ride in a car for 11 miles. Not surprisingly, he finished first, but was subsequently disqualified. The gold medal eventually went to another American, Thomas Hicks, who completed the race thanks to a diet of strychnine and raw egg white. In 1920, the Olympics were held in Antwerp, Belgium. By then, Finland was becoming the dominant force in distance running, with the great Paavo Nurmi winning the 10,000 meters and finishing second in the 5,000. In the marathon, 4 of the top finishers were from Finland, including Hannes Kollimainen, who in 1912 had won both the shorter distance events and the now discontinued 8,000 meters cross-country race. He then emigrated to America and for several years disappeared from athletics. The lure of the Olympic Games brought him back, and Kollimainen triumphed in Antwerp. His 13-second win over Yuri Losman of Estonia would remain the closest finish in the men's Olympic marathon until 1996. The victory laurels 4 years later went to another Finn, although in complete contrast, this race was won by almost 6 minutes. The local refreshments in Paris might have had something to do with that. In the marathon's early days, it was not uncommon for runners, even race leaders, to drop out through severe stomach cramps due to drinking the local organizers' concoction. In France, where wine is always best when gently sipped, it proved a welcome distraction from the grueling miles on the road. In those days, the marathon, like life itself, was at a very much more relaxed pace. Albin Steenroos, who'd not run a single marathon for 15 years prior to 1924, was the runaway winner, keeping the title in Finland. The popularity of the Olympic Games continued to grow. By the time of the Amsterdam Games 4 years later, there was so much competition between film crews that rights had to be granted for the prime positions. The marathon route took the runners along a traditional Dutch course. Algerian-born Bougherra El Ouafi, running for France, won with 26 seconds to spare. El Ouafi was the first North African to win an Olympic title of any description. But his life was to end in poverty, and at the age of 60, he was shot dead while sitting in a Paris cafe. The marathon continued to produce winners who would illustrate its global appeal. The 1932 marathon was won by Juan Carlos Zabala of Argentina. Four years later, Asia claimed its first winner. He was actually a fervent Korean nationalist, but Son Ki-chung was forced to run under another nation's flag, as his country was, at the time, annexed by Japan. Son, by now a national hero in Korea, wasted no time in publicizing his country's plight to the international media.
Marathon 42
Son Ki-chung carried both happy and bitter memories of this episode into his later years.
Nobody knows exactly how I felt running with the Japanese flag on my chest. Only those who have experienced the feeling of being stateless could possibly understand. It's very hard even now to put into focus.
For Son, his moment of pride would come years later when the Games went to Seoul. He was given the honor of carrying the Olympic flame into the stadium at the opening ceremony. Son was 76 years old, but the touching moment brought tears of emotion from a proud nation. The rich history of the marathon is littered with agonizing tales of misfortune. One of these belongs to a 25-year-old Belgian paratrooper, Etienne Gailly. In 1948, the Games returned to London, although the course was very different from the Windsor Park to White City route that had established the event's distance. Gailly had led for more than half of the race and was still ahead when he entered Wembley Stadium for the final lap. But there, the legs of the Belgian dramatically gave way, and his gold medal ambitions disappeared. First, Delfo Cabrera of Argentina passed him to take the lead. Then, Britain's Tom Richards relegated him to third place. At one point, Gailly considered quitting. He was spurred on by an inner strength that convinced him that he could still play a part in Olympic history by earning a bronze medal. Cabrera became Argentina's second Olympic marathon champion. For Etienne Gailly, the road to glory had been a little too long. When you talk about distance racing and the Olympic Games, one man stands tall among other legends. If ever an athlete conquered the long road to glory, it was Emil Zatopek of Czechoslovakia. In Helsinki in 1952, Zatopek became the first runner since Hannes Kolomainen to win both the 5,000 and 10,000 meters. In the 5,000 meters final, he was trailed home by the Algerian-born Frenchman Alain Mimoun, who was often referred to as the eternal second. They would meet again many times. But 2 gold medals was clearly not enough for Zatopek. He went for a unique treble by running the most grueling event of all, the marathon, a race that was completely new to him.
Before the marathon, all was clear for me. I was the world record holder for 20 kilometers, and each day I ran 30 kilometers in training. That gave me hope. But to be honest, I had no direct experience with the marathon.
As if this triple task was not daunting enough, he had to run all 3 races in the same week. In the marathon, Zatopek closely followed pre-race favourites, Britain's Jim Peters and Gustav Jansson of Sweden, for the first half of the race, to acquaint himself with the correct pace. Peters then began to fade and eventually dropped out. Zatopek never wilted and seemed relaxed enough to chat and joke along the way. He never lost the lead again. When he entered the stadium in Helsinki, He was greeted by a huge roar and the crowd chanting his name. It was one of the most moving moments in Olympic history. Zatopek is still the only athlete to win the 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, and marathon at the same Olympics. He was later quoted as saying he'd been unable to walk for a whole week afterwards. But, he added, it was the most pleasant exhaustion I've ever known. In 1956, the Olympics were held for the first time in the Southern Hemisphere. Although it was December, the Melbourne summer weather gave the marathon runners no respite from the heat. The runners were finally off, following the one and only false start in the marathon's history. In the field once more, Zatopek, with 4 Olympic gold medals and 18 world records to his name. And his old adversary, Alain Mimoun, who had been second to the great Czechoslovak runner 3 times in the Games. Mimoun, like Zatopek 4 years earlier, chose the Olympic Games to make his marathon debut. It was to pay off handsomely. He took the lead before the halfway mark and never let go. By the finish, he was some 90 seconds clear. But the Frenchman still waited for his old rival Zatopek, who finished 6th. The scene at the end was a touching moment between 2 great champions of differing cultures. It demonstrated that the Olympic spirit was very much alive. Only 33 of the 46 elite athletes completed the 1956 course in the trying conditions. So 4 years later in Rome, the Italians scheduled the marathon for the early evening. A record number of entrants turned up. It was a year for firsts. The first Olympic marathon to start and finish outside the stadium, and the first to be won by a black African. Before the race, he was a complete unknown. But his world record-breaking barefoot run illuminated Rome's evening skies. His was one of the outstanding achievements in Olympic history. His name, Abibi Bikila. Bikila's victory put his unheralded nation on the sporting map. Ethiopia had never before won an Olympic medal. Now, it had an internationally acclaimed hero. Back home, the 28-year-old member of Emperor Haile Selassie's elite bodyguard was feted wherever he went. His victory in Rome would kindle a flame of hope for all of Black Africa, a mantle that would be carried into later decades by Ethiopian, Tanzanian, and of course, Kenyan runners. In Tokyo 4 years later, Bikila proudly carried his country's flag at the opening ceremony. Despite having his appendix removed only 40 days before the marathon, he lined up at the back of the field in a bid to become the first man to win consecutive Olympic titles at this highly demanding discipline. The field also included the great Australian, Ron Clark, who was running his 4th race in a week, and Kokichi Subaraya, who carried the heavy burden of an expectant home nation. But despite his handicap, Bikila moved into the lead before the halfway point. He then just ran the opposition off their feet. His winning margin was an astonishing 4 minutes, the largest winning distance since 1924. He even clipped almost 2 minutes off the world's best time for the marathon. Perhaps this was an even more incredible feat than his Rome victory. He had run himself into the history books as the first man to retain an Olympic marathon title. Watched by an excited crowd of 75,000, including Emperor Hirohito, Tsuburaya entered the Olympic Stadium in the silver medal position. But on the final bend, Japan's hoped-for hero suffered what proved to be the ultimate humiliation by being overtaken by Britain's Basil Heatley. Tsuburaya never recovered emotionally from this incident. He tried to train for the next games, but had appalling injury problems. Tragically, he committed suicide in 1967, leaving behind a short note which read simply, "Cannot run anymore." Habibi Bikila enjoyed an extraordinary record as a marathon runner, a record unsurpassed by any athlete past or present. By the time of the 1968 Games, he had won no less than 12 of the 14 marathons he had entered. But he was never quite able to produce the phenomenal form that he showed in Tokyo. And in the high altitude of Mexico City, it would all be very different. A foot injury sustained the year before forced the great Ethiopian to retire before the end of the race. It would be his last appearance at the Games. A year later, he was involved in a horrendous car crash that left him almost completely paralyzed. And in 1973, following a severe hemorrhage, this great man died. He was just 40. But the legacy of elite long-distance running that Habibi Bikila left behind in Ethiopia would reap more rewards in the years that followed. Mamo Wolde had made his first appearance in the Games back in 1956 and had failed miserably in both the 800 and 1500-meter events. But the longer the distance, the better he became. Wolde picked up the pace and left everyone behind with 20 miles gone. He was now on the verge of a unique treble in the marathon. Wolde's winning time was slow in the altitude, but he successfully kept the title in Ethiopian possession for the third Games running. Few of the spectators that day were there to witness the other emotional story of the marathon. John Stephen Akwari from Tanzania was injured and in great pain as he struggled around the course in almost 3.5 hours. But his determination to complete the long road to glory was an extraordinary example of the spirit of the Olympic Games. When questioned later, Aquari said, "My country did not send me to the Olympic Games to start the race. They sent me to finish it." Mamo Wolde was back to defend his title 4 years later in Munich. At the age of 40, he was to run his fastest ever marathon, although he could only finish third. The story of the 1972 marathon was about Frank Shorter. He had been born in Munich, educated at Yale, and was obsessive about winning the marathon title for America. He was not, however, the first to enter Munich's Olympic Stadium. That honor was claimed by a German student called Norbert Zutthaus. The world held its breath for a few moments as this hoaxer had everyone baffled. Only when Zutthaus was discovered and taken away did Shorter, the deserved winner, enjoy his moment of glory. Shorter's victory was to prove to be a watershed in the story of the marathon. This was the first time that the event had been fully captured by television. Live pictures were beamed into homes throughout America. The 2-hour battle for gold made for good viewing, and to cap it all, an American won.
I think people looked at me and said, well, he's not very big, he doesn't look very strong, and yet he can do this, and he doesn't seem much different from the people who live down the street. And I think that maybe got people interested.
The impact can now be seen the world over. From the smaller events in every town and district, to the 30,000-strong fields at the world's biggest city marathons. At the peak of the running boom in the mid-80s, it is estimated that in America alone, 10% of the population went jogging. Many of them aspire to run a marathon.
The interesting thing about the marathon is that the distances is just perfect to test someone both physically and mentally.
Montreal 1976, and boycotts were about to hit the Olympic Games. For the next 3 games, the marathon would miss some of its finest athletes. On this occasion, 22 African nations did not attend. The favorite was the reigning champion, although Frank Shorter knew that only the great Abibi Bikila had won 2 Olympic marathons. Shorter had to face the bearded Lasse Viren, an extraordinarily talented Finn, who'd already won both the 5,000 and 10,000 meter races, and was making his debut in the marathon. The conditions were humid. As the race progressed, it began to rain. One man relished that. The German Democratic Republic had never before enjoyed success in this discipline. Waldemir Czapinski, a 26-year-old virtual unknown, had a personal best of 2 hours, 17 minutes, 30 seconds at the beginning of the Olympic year. In Montreal, he ran almost 8 minutes faster, smashing Bikila's Olympic record. His winning time of 2 hours, 9 minutes and 55 seconds was extraordinarily fast. Shorter finished almost a minute behind, even though he was 94 seconds quicker than his winning time in Munich. Viren's performance in coming 5th only 24 hours after winning the 10,000 meters was also remarkable. Czapinski, however, was Olympic champion, the first East German to win any of the world's major marathons. Czapinski arrived in Moscow for the 1980 Olympic Games to defend his title, not having beaten a decent marathon field in the 4 years since Montreal. The field was again diminished with no Americans or Japanese, who by then were beginning to make a significant impact on the marathon at world level. This time, Czapinski was to show himself a worthy Olympic champion, proving that Montreal had been no fluke. He was 2 days short of his 30th birthday and had equaled the feat of Abibi Bikila in successfully defending the Olympic marathon title. By the time Carlos Lopez of Portugal arrived in Los Angeles for the 1984 Olympic marathon, he had seen a 3-year-long battle against injury look likely to end what should have been a top-class career. Despite winning silver in the 10,000 meters in Montreal, he'd been written off by the experts at the age of 37.
I felt a lot of pressure, and some of it was very personal. It just created a lot of problems for me. But even though I had many critics who said that I wouldn't be able to run any more great races, I proved them wrong. It was a major battle for me, and I was more than ever determined to win.
The favourites were the American Alberto Salazar, the world record holder, and Australian Rob de Castella, the reigning world champion. Despite the searing Californian heat, the pace was relentless. The winning time would smash the Olympic record. In the final miles, Lopez, in the red shorts, just turned on the pressure, and one by one, his opponents dropped away. He beat Czapinski's record time by more than half a minute, finishing in 2 hours, 9 minutes and 21 seconds, the fastest Olympic marathon run of all time. Lopez had also become the first ever Olympic gold medalist for Portugal, an achievement that earned him a huge homecoming in Lisbon. Los Angeles 1984 also marked an historic development in the story of the marathon, the acceptance of women into the Olympic event. Norway's Grete Waitz and the American world record holder Joan Benoit were the joint pre-race favourites. It was the American who prevailed in the Los Angeles heat, and Waitz had to content herself with the silver medal. While Benoit was celebrating what was an historic achievement, some 20 minutes after she'd finished, a lonely figure staggered onto the track. Switzerland's Gabriela Anderson-Schiess rekindled memories of Dorando Pietri's gallant final strides decades ago. Suffering from severe heat exhaustion, the determined Schiess limped around the track in what seemed an eternity. 5 minutes and 44 seconds. For both women that day, a share of the honours and the road to glory. It had been a new dawn in the long battle to have women accepted into the Olympic movement as long-distance athletes. Many women, who might not otherwise have attempted the longer distances, tried the marathon. Portugal's Rosa Mota was the bronze medalist in 1984. When she arrived in Seoul for the second Olympic women's marathon, she'd already won the Boston Marathon twice and the World Championship by some 7 minutes. She was the outstanding favourite. One by one, she wore down the field. It was a move some 2.5 miles from the finish that finally saw off the most determined challenger, Australia's Lisa Martin. Ironically, Mota's own federation had banned her from Seoul after an internal dispute. It took Portugal's Minister for Sport to grant her permission to run, and the chance to emulate Carlos Lopez's achievement in Los Angeles. In the men's marathon, Africans were among the favorites, led by the Tanzanian Juma Ikanga and the world champion Douglas Wakihuri of Kenya. The conditions were hot and humid. It was very thirsty work for some. For others, the heat was debilitating. Eventually, the medal contenders were reduced to just 3, with the pre-race favorite Ahmed Saleh of Djibouti leading Wakihuri and the Italian Gelindo Bordin. With 3 miles to go, Saleh began to pull away from the exhausted Wakihuri and Bordin. But Bordin, after suffering for quite some time, suddenly found reserves of energy. A mile from the finish, he caught up with and overtook the shocked Saleh. From that moment on, Bordin knew that he had won. This was a rare and welcome long-distance victory for Italy. 7 years before, Bordin had been struck from behind by a car while out on a training run and was presumed dead. He could hardly have thought that one day he would become Olympic champion. Wakihuri overtook Saleh for the silver medal. The man from Djibouti was third. Gelindo Bordin was so exhausted after his achievements that he could scarcely raise a word for the world's media. In Barcelona in 1992, the weather was just as hot and humid, even though the women's marathon was run in the evening. Both the men's and women's race produced exciting finishes. The final climb up the hill to the Montjuic Stadium severely tested the runners' resolve. The women's race was a classic battle between the 28-year-old Russian, Valentina Yegorova, representing the unified team, and in the white, Yuko Arimori of Japan. As they entered the closing stages, Yegorova finally broke away. But her lead going to the Olympic Stadium was fragile, to say the least. It was enough. Yegorova won by 6 seconds. It was the closest finish there had ever been in any Olympic marathon. When the tension of the battle had subsided, there was a touching moment between these two great competitors. The men's race was the very first medal event of the Games, and what a race it turned out to be. The Korean, Hwang Young-cho on the left, and Japan's Koichi Morishita raced side by side for 26 miles. One of the great contests of the Barcelona Games, both men suffered intensely in the scorching heat, but were determined not to give in. Hwang appeared first in the stadium. He had finally broken his rival's resistance on the devastating climb up Montjuic. He was ecstatic. Hwang's gold medal was perhaps a fitting tribute to his great compatriot Son Ki-cho, who 56 years before, to the very day, had won the marathon but had been denied the honor of representing his native Korea. For Morishita, the consolation of an Olympic silver medal, only 22 seconds behind. Both athletes were so exhausted after their battle that they needed medical attention. For Korea, their second gold medal in the event, but their first national anthem. In Atlanta 4 years later, another athlete, inspired by a predecessor and compatriot, ran into the history books. Fatuma Roba of Ethiopia took up marathon running in 1993. In earlier years, she had watched the great Abibi Bikila pioneer African dominance of long-distance running and pledged to do the same for the women of Africa. In 1996, she was not among the favorites to win the gold medal. The race favorite, Germany's Ute Pippig, set off at a furious rate. Roba and the defending champion, Valentina Yegorova, followed at a wiser pace. At 11 miles, Roba made her break from the pack to lead by 6 seconds. At 12 miles, she extended that lead. By 15, she was nearly half a minute in front. 18 miles, and she had over a minute's lead. And so it continued. Roba finished over 2 minutes ahead of Yegorova, the widest margin of victory in the history of the women's Olympic marathon. Roba had fulfilled her promise. She was the first African woman to win the Olympic marathon, and hopefully she would inspire others. The men's event began with a record. An unprecedented 124 runners lined up for the start. Among them was a South African, Josiah Thugwane, who 3 months earlier had seen his life almost come to an end when he was shot during a carjacking. Thugwane was determined to compete in Atlanta. Running was what brought him pleasure and relief from his life of poverty in a South Africa still adjusting to a post-apartheid society. As he put it, an hour's running pays more than 30 days' work. Thugwane ran with the Korean Bong Joo Lee and Eric Wainaina of Kenya into the final third of race. With 1 mile to go, he forged ahead. The others could not respond, and it was the South African who entered the stadium first. At the finish line, just 8 seconds separated the three. But it was Thugwane who took gold. Josiah Thugwane wrapped himself in his nation's flag and basked in the applause of the crowd as the first black South African to win an Olympic gold medal. At Sydney, the marathon race was once again dominated by African runners. Kenyan Eric Wainaina was the early leader, followed closely by Gizanya Abera Tesfaye Tola of Ethiopia. A frustrated Wainaina, tired of having his heels clipped, gestured to Abera to take the lead. Abera seized the opportunity. He passed the Kenyan, increased his lead step by step, and went on to win his country's first Olympic marathon medal since 1972, and first gold since Mamo Wolde's victory in Mexico in 1968. The women's competition was held on a humid Sydney morning. Japanese runner Takahashi Naoko and Lydia Simon of Romania took an early lead. The pair shared the lead until Takahashi's long, steady strides took her away from the Romanian, with 4.5 miles to go. Her victory, which set an Olympic record of 2 hours, 23 minutes and 14 seconds, was the first athletics gold won by a Japanese woman. In 2004, the Olympic marathon returned to the place where it all began. The race started in the village of Marathon and followed the original route to Athens. One of the favourites for the gold medal was the world record holder Paula Radcliffe from Great Britain, who had recently recovered from injury. But after 23 miles in searing heat, Mizuki Noguchi from Japan held a commanding lead. For Radcliffe, injury, exhaustion, and the realization that the race was lost led to a tearful withdrawal. Having led from the 16-mile stage, Noguchi went on to beat Kenyan Catherine Endereba, with America's Dina Castor taking the bronze. The men's race was even more dramatic. By the halfway mark, the race had a surprise leader, Vanderlei de Lima from Brazil, who had forged well ahead of the chasing pack. But 4 miles from the finish, de Lima was suddenly impeded by a protester and bundled to the side of the road.
It was a total shock, which really unsettled me both physically and mentally. I started to feel a lot of pain in my muscles when I began running again, and I lost my concentration. Up to then, I'd been totally focused on what I was doing.
Even before the Italian Stefano Baldini had been closing in on de Lima, and after almost exactly 2 hours, passed him to take a lead he would not relinquish.
I would have certainly won anyway. I would have caught him after 39 kilometers rather than at 38, but I was running much quicker than him at that point of the race.
Baldini took the gold medal for Italy 16 years after Gelindo Bordin had triumphed in Seoul. But it was de Lima who entered the stadium to a hero's welcome. He bravely hung on to win the bronze medal. At the closing ceremony, de Lima received the Pierre de Coubertin medal for his outstanding sportsmanship. Four years later in Beijing, the marathon runners faced dauntingly humid conditions. But in the women's race, Romania's Constantina Ditia was making light work of the challenge. Having been inspired to take up distance running after watching her compatriot Marichica Puica winning gold in the 3,000 meters at the LA Olympics in 1984, Ditia controlled the race from the early stages. She eventually triumphed in a time of 2 hours, 26 minutes and 44 seconds. At 38 years of age, she became the oldest marathon champion in the history of the Olympics. In the men's race, all eyes were on one young runner, despite the marathon being a discipline that many athletes graduate to after first making a name at shorter distances. Kenya's Samuel Wanjiru was just one of 98 athletes from 57 nations competing. But the 21-year-old was truly a man apart. And when he made his move, the field was broken. Having already improved upon the legendary Ethiopian Haile Gebrselassie half-marathon record by over 20 seconds the previous year, there was never any question that Wanjiru was fast. But on the roads of Beijing, he proved his mettle on sport's greatest stage as he took gold in a new Olympic record time of 2 hours, 6 minutes and 32 seconds, smashing the previous best of Carlos Lopez, set in LA back in 1984, by almost 3 minutes. Tragically, Wanjiro was to die just 3 years later and never had the chance to defend his title. As long as the marathon is part of the Olympic program, it will continue to provide as much drama as any discipline. As Emil Zatopek, one of the finest Olympic distance runners of all time, once said, "If you want to run, run a mile. If you want to experience another life, run a marathon."